and death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one, with the man in the wind and the west moon, when their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone. They shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion.
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. And even more so because you have just manifested yourself at Aeon by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning, a crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy, a virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, yours falsely, the autodidact and idiot savant Miguel Connor, is allowed to commandeer your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention.
I'm the saint of blasphemy.
Fun, compelling, and deeply weird. This is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. And certainly the one your parents, teachers, religious czars, political overlords, and ruling angels were afraid you might run into and begin the greatest adventure of all, finding out who you really are and what reality is not at all.
Welcome to the Revelation Superhighway.
You have arrived, as the Gospel of Tommy says, to be disturbed when you find the meaning of the mystic blog posts of the reason of the divine you subscribed to long before you were tied to the body of a dying mammal, but lost it in the spam of Jehovah's hosting programs. And then, as the Gospel of Tommy continues, you will be amazed like a Texas A&M freshman at his first donkey show when you begin not tasting death of any kind.
It is death who should be afraid of us.
Welcome to the machine and the means to escape it. Welcome to a dream of you. Welcome with kindness and love to the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West. Always broadcast through the God Above God Dadcam. Are you ready to continue to writing your own gospel and living your own myth? Are you ready to go into the heart of darkness and your dark night of the soul to bring forth your crazy shining diamond, held in the minds of consumerism and conformity by the powers and principalities who have made you into nothing more than a techno-peasant and a white-collar Sisyphus?
See all this potential, and I see it squandering. God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars.
I think this quote not only sums up our sacred quest, but also the very powerful topic we discuss in this eternal now, from the Nag Hammadi Library's Treatise of Resurrection. The Lord said, "The governors and the administrators possess garments granted only for a time, which do not last. But you, as children of truth, not with these transitory garments, are you to clothe yourselves. Rather, I say to you that you will become blessed when you strip yourselves."
And I was hoping for some sort of tactical plan that didn't involve martyrdom.
We are the Gnostics, the lovers of the esoterica and the Dionysian freethinkers. We are the Pompatus of Gnosis, the eternal astro creeps becoming more human than human, and that cosmic rebel yell where Sophia cries out, "More, more, more." We are the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars who have set the controls to the heart of the sun. We are Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, with one hand urging our brothers and sisters to take the paths of the moon, also known as the midnight sun of Isis, that heals the ass in each one of us, as Lucius found out, and then dare an odyssey across the oceans of forgetfulness.
What is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
Yet with our other hand, we give the finger to secular life coaches, New Age gurus, and fundagelical pastors, pointing at the very same moon and saying, "Don't look at my hand pointing at the moon, but at the moon itself." Oh, that's great. Yet they also stand there on their private Malibu beaches and sink in the sands of their own blind beliefs and manipulated science and logic turned solipsism.
Are you a clergyman or just a PR man? When you come right down to it, Mr. Carter, is there any difference?
And let's not forget that their free hand has their other finger snugly up their bungholes, massaging their prostates of self-importance and social status. But not us. As Giordano Bruno once wrote, heroic love belongs to those we like to call insane, not because of what they don't know, but because they know too much. Yes, my beloved truth seekers, we know too much. We feel too much. We just can't stomach the inexorable principle of suffering permeating creation, and thus we must rage against heaven, for humanity's paradise is lost. Like Edmund Lupiere once said, eyes to see, ears to hear. That is the tragic ability of the Gnostic.
One day, somebody's gonna have to make a stand. One day, somebody's gonna have to say enough.
The rest of you Jamba Juice occultists and Dora the Explorer mystics can go and find succor in buying the 5 Agreements desk calendar, but never reading it, watching the James Cameron adaptation of The Secret, or saying gormless things like, "I'm not a human experiencing spiritual things, but a spirit experiencing human things." What the heck does that even mean? Go be Aquamans, spreading your useless waves to change the consciousness of humanity across the world.
He who questions training only trains himself at asking questions. What?
I swear on Odin's testicles that New Agers and the Orthodox have drank so much of their own Kool-Aid of spiritual materialism, they can't tell who the other is anymore. It's like the ending of Animal Farm. But you can't blame them, really. We have reached maximum density and maximum altitude in this age of mirror maze media, bankrupt rationalism, religious cronyism, machine gun propaganda from corporate oligarchies, and collective schizophrenia, much of it caused by the alter ego creating sweatshops of social networks and famed Xanadu's.
Shh! I need silence to mind meld with the internet.
We, as an evolving species in the West, have hit a noetic cul-de-sac in all matters except technological. And that technology has pilfered our ability to focus on the sublime by Stepford wiping our attention spans and concentration.
Do I make myself clear?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
2,000 years of Abrahamic Pokemon games has not only left us in exile, but finally gotten us lost in, yes, the desert of the real. We're linear in our imagination, myopic in our moral development, and Joshua-like in our exploration and exploitation of others, under the frozen sun of our childhood dreams and before the collapsing walls of failed relationships.
Do you ever get tired of watching bad things happen to people? That's crazy talk.
No matter what position we seem to take in any issue or ideology, there seems to be an immediate equal and opposite reactionary stance that, in the spirit of the Church Fathers, brands us heretics and sentences our personalities in politically correct gulags. We spend more time handing each other scarlet letters than doing for the least of our brothers.
What makes it so hard is not that you had it bad, but that you're that pissed that so many others had it good.
There seems to be no innovative breathing room in metaphysics or civics. Humanity still reeling from the 20th century carnage of runaway theism and atheism. And the 21st century looks no better from this ship of fools. It's like the ending of Animal Farm.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
But the solution, as the classic Gnostics offered and even urged, as seen in the early Sethian writings or the Gospel of Thomas number 18, was to go back to the beginning of the end and understand it, correct it, and even rewrite it to offer overlooked possibilities.
When the long night comes, return to the end of the beginning.
Watered down Eastern beliefs that Applejacks embrace state that the past doesn't exist. But the universal truth is that you may be through with the past, but the past ain't through with you. Both human and history have traumas that always need to be addressed. If we don't look back and see wisdom falling from the oneness, how will we be able to catch her?
She tore a hole in our universe, a gateway to another dimension. A dimension of pure chaos. Pure evil.
And our astral guest takes the Gnostic torch and shines it on many traumas. This is the sage and baronial Arthur Verslus, joining the virtual Alexandria to discuss his total recall work, The Mystical State, Politics and Emergent Cultures. Arthur's also the author of The Secret History of Western Sexual Mysticism, Magic and Mysticism, An Introduction to Western Esoteric Traditions, and The New Inquisitions, as well as chair of the Department of Religious Studies and professor in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University.
Let me have your attention for a moment. Talk about something important. Coffee's for closers only.
For more information on Arthur, please visit his website, arthurverslus.com. And that is Arthur, VERSLUIS.com. This is the second time he has enshrined Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, back when it was called Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, on our 37th episode, where he discussed his sobering book, The New Inquisitions. Arthur revealed, and I alluded to, that the notion of heresy hunting by the Church Fathers against the Gnostics and other alternative Christians was the true Baba Yaga womb of thought police and the totalitarian mentality.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
For the first time in history, as Arthur more than proved, what you thought or believed made you a criminal instead of your actions, as most ancients practiced for the most part. From the Spanish Inquisition to the communist movements, from the Christian right-wing lobbying to the Muslim bullying, it has instilled a collective unconscious fear that has become one of the kryptonites of our modern culture.
I remember how the meaning of words began to change. How unfamiliar words like collateral and rendition became frightening, while things like Northfire and the Articles of Allegiance became powerful. I remember how different became dangerous. I still don't understand it. Why they hate us so much.
But enough of my drivel. Arthur Verslus and the Mystical Estate. And then a little more drivel on Basilides. And let's hope it doesn't end up looking like the end of Animal Farm.
What we need right now is a clear message to the people of this country. This message must be read in every newspaper, heard on every radio, seen on every television. This message must resound throughout the entire interlink. I want this country to realize that we stand on the edge of oblivion. I want every man, woman, and child to understand how close we are to chaos. I want everyone to remember why they need us.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined by Arthur Verslus to discuss his new book, The Mystical State, Politics, Gnosis, and Emergent Cultures. How are you doing today, Arthur?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me on, Miguel.
Well, thank you for coming back on Aeon Byte. Your new book, The Mystical State, explains that at the beginning of a long explains the beginning of a long ending that has culminated with secular modernity, and it happened in the early stages of Christendom. This sort of ties in with your last book, the New Inquisition. What was this seismic shift that plunged Western culture in a state of hopeless duality and a rejection of the sacred transcendental?
I think one of the things that we need to look at in thinking about an answer to a question like that is monotheism, actually. And I think the emergence of monotheism has a lot to do with the later development of Western society. Monotheism, I suggest in the book, has built into it duality, a kind of intrinsic dualism of the idea of a personal God or a separate, a God separate from creation. I think that has, to some extent, haunted us, not only in the West, but wherever monotheism has gone. And that isn't to say that there aren't other ways of understanding monotheism, but a dualistic one is where I locate a good portion of the dualism that I think characterizes our own era.
Yeah, and don't you call it monolatry instead?
Yeah, the idea of monolatry is that derives from close reading of the Old Testament, and there's a book by Regina Schwartz on this subject called The Curse of Cain, and she's the one who came up with this term monolatry. Monolatry is different from monotheism in that it refers to the worship of one God among many gods, which is what actually you see in the Old Testament. So she uses that term to distinguish it from the idea that there is only one deity. Really, what you see in the Old Testament is the separating of one deity out from a multiplicity of deities. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it, and a challenging way of thinking about the Old Testament and monotheism.
And how did exactly this happen? I mean, as you're talking, Christians began to see God as this separate being who wanted us to lord over the land. But as time went on, man became more dependent on reason, and reason brought us into all the wonderful experiments of the 20th century. How did we get here? How do we lose our awe for the sacred?
There's different ways of thinking about that, and when you think about the era in which we live, it's really striking how invisible or how little mysticism plays a role. And I think really part of what's happened is that the sense of mysticism, or of a recognition that there actually are people who focus their attention on inward life and direct spiritual experience, that those people really have almost ceased to exist, ceased to be on the radar at all. And that's even true in terms of scholarship on mysticism. There's very, very little. And I think this absence is linked to, on the other hand, the hegemony of instrumental reason, of a dualistic way of seeing the world, which is driven by a technological approach. And I think that the development of the world that we live in, which is in crisis now in many respects, that's been a slow development, and it has been triumphant in a lot of respects. I'm not saying it hasn't. There are great achievements, technological achievements of our society, but at the same time, there's very little focus on the inward life in the way that a great mystic in the way that you see in a great mystic of the medieval period, Meister Eckhart, for example. There just aren't very many Meister Eckharts today.
And you also write in one part of the mystical state that historicity is the bane of our era. What exactly do you mean by this, Arthur?
Well, that bundles in with the themes that we've been talking about. It's woven in with them. Historicity, what I'm referring to there is the sense that history, temporality, secular understanding of time as really bearing very little relation to what sometimes is referred to as eternity or timelessness or non-dual understanding, that the era that we're living in is defined by temporality in a way that constrains us. That means that in the same way that we don't find contemporary mystics to any great degree or certainly having any kind of cultural effect, that is tied in. Mystics are people for whom eternity or transcendence is their living space. That's where they live, and what we see in contemporary society, despite its technological achievements, is very different from that. So that's really what I'm referring to is not just history or perception of history. I mean, I'm to some extent a historian myself, historian of ideas. What I'm referring to rather is a way of understanding time and being caught in that understanding of time only in a kind of secular sense. I think that's the bane of our era.
And it seems this is influenced definitely by Abrahamic thinking, because the Bible or Christian, Jewish, or Muslim story, history is very set in stone. There's a beginning, a middle, and a definite end, and we're just stuck in this linear time, and we really shouldn't worry about transcending it, right?
Well, that's right. And actually that's a really valuable point that you raised, because this idea of millennialism, of being driven toward some kind of imagined future or projected future, whether it's something that's extracted from the book of Revelation, seen in some sort of historical projection or looking for messianic figures, has also had secular consequences. You end up with secular states that are looking for some kind of millennial future, and that's caused a great deal of suffering, actually. I think the secular application of these ideas ends up becoming very destructive, and you see that in the history, for example, of communism, which has not fully been grappled with, I think, even though the Iron Curtain fell. I think in terms of the ideas, people haven't gotten to the core of what happened when communism became dominant in a society. So it ties in very much with the secular millennialism.
And don't you offer some possibilities? I believe you write about Gershom Scholem talking about counter-history.
Well, that's really what the mystical state is about. It is to some extent an exploration of a counter-history. What Scholem was writing about is the idea that there's a kind of a mainstream history that leaves out a lot of things. And he went back and looked at the history of Kabbalah and found a very different history could be written, which he called a counter-history. And that's, in effect, what this book is. It's a counter-history. It's a way of understanding how we got to where we are, exploring that in new ways, and understanding our own situation in new ways. And it really represents the fruition of a lot of a lot of previous work that I've tried to make accessible, but it's a book in which I work through a counter history, and it is an extension of what I did with New Inquisitions, but it strikes into new territory, and it also is more optimistic. I'm not only retrospective in mystical state, I'm also prospective, looking toward possible futures that are affirmative, so that it isn't simply critical without offering a vision.
Yeah, and one of your solutions is obviously to go back to the past and find out these forks in the road that we could have taken. And one of them, as you write, is that there was, you talk about the school of Basilides and his ideas of Gnosis, and they seem to be a solution, or they seem to be a way that was rejected by orthodoxy. Could you tell us a little about Gnosis through the eyes of Basilides?
Yeah, Basilides is someone, as you well know, we possess only fragments of Basilides' work, but what's interesting about him is that what we do possess is negative way mysticism. It's mysticism of pure transcendence, much like you see in Dionysius the Areopagite. And it's very analogous to Buddhism. It's not uncommon for scholars to locate Basilides very close, and his son and his school very close to Buddhism. And I think that's correct. I think that there is a lot of resonance between the two, and that kind of non-dual consciousness or non-dual awareness that you see in Basilides' fragments is also central to Buddhism in the Prajnaparamita, and that tradition of absolute transcendence, of non-dual awareness. And that is what I'm arguing is central to what I refer to as emergent cultures. That culture comes out of that. Originally, at its center, culture emerges out of that non-dual awareness, and that's a very important part of what I'm doing in the book. So Basilides is a signal figure, I think. So too is Plotinus in a different way. But I think they're very important in understanding what a fork in the road, a shift that took place very early in Christianity, because Basilides was in the period really only shortly after the death of Jesus, and in the century thereafter. So Basilides is early, and he represents an entirely different path that Christianity as a whole could have taken. I think he's a very important figure.
Yeah, and also you mentioned Plotinus is very important. How does Plotinus compare and contrast with Basilides?
Well, we only have fragments of Basilides, and I think they're really important fragments, and then some sense of how Basilides, how his school worked as a school of the realization of this non-dual awareness that you find alluded to in the fragments, whereas in the case of Plotinus, you have this grand metaphysical set of treatises that really bear rereading. I really, would encourage anyone to go back to Plotinus's Enneads and read those, and especially if you just want to read one, the fifth book, because there he gives a very detailed sequential perspective on how to move toward non-dual consciousness and how one did that within the Platonic tradition, which is in many ways consonant with monotheism. It's not totally opposed to it. It's just not monolatry. It's a very different way of understanding what deity is, or how one as an individual can move up toward deeper or higher states of awareness and consciousness. So I think What you get in Plotinus is quite different. There, it's rational, it's reasoned, but it's a reasoned exposition of that which ultimately transcends reason. So that Plotinus is the other favorite that I have actually in the book. I'm very fond of both Plotinus and Basilides, as you might have gathered.
Yeah, even though Plotinus wasn't very keen on the Gnostics himself, he had his problems with them.
Well, he did, and yet that's a little vexed. That's a bit vexed of a question, because it's not exactly clear to me to whom he was referring to, and exactly in what context. I don't think that Plotinus's judgment would have been negative of somebody like Basilides, for example. I don't think the two of them ultimately would have had that much conflict were they to have sat down. That's just my hunch. But it is true that Plotinus was critical of what he saw as world rejection, or a kind of, I would argue, a kind of dualism, which I think does characterize and come out of as a kind of variant form of monotheism. And we've talked about that. And I think Plotinus was critical of that in some of its manifestations. But I'm not so convinced that he was anti-Gnostic in a more fulsome sense. I don't think so.
So what we have is this split in history, where we have the one side, the Basilides, Plotinus idea of living the Socratic examined life, going inward, and also trying for that direct experience of God. And then the other side, which basically believed in the providence of God in history, and this was more faith-based and almost predestined. It was that straight stream of line, and they broke off. Did the Basilides Plotinus view, did it come out throughout history?
Well, you definitely see different periods and in different times and different people who become champions, you might say, of non-dual awareness. And Meister Eckhart is a important medieval example of that, but by no means the only one. There are a number of others, and they're in a Christian context, and sometimes a Jewish context, sometimes a Muslim context. If you want to talk about the three monotheisms, these folks who emphasize a non-dual perspective do recur. But there's always a tension there. There's often a tension, and Meister Eckhart was very close to being brought up on charges, and in fact his work was at one point condemned. There's always been a kind of tension between him and this other way of thinking or way of understanding things, which I think you summarized really well. You know, I think there is a tension between, on the one hand, a kind of faith, belief-based, more historical kind of religious perspective, and on the other hand, one that emphasizes gnosis and inward life.
Yeah, and all these characters, like you said, got in hot water. You talk, Jacob Boehme, you said, was told to stop writing, and perhaps the most famous, I guess, medieval luminary of Neoplatonism, Giordano Bruno. Well, things didn't go well for him either, did they?
No, it's a sad series of vignettes when you go back and look at many of these figures. Some escaped too much censure. Johannes Tauler, for example, was okay. It depends how individually they negotiated these things. And Bruno was pretty intemperate sometimes, and he was betrayed by this fellow Mocenigo, and the Inquisition got him. Others like John Portage, probably the greatest English mystic who ever lived. He died in 1681. Portage just went. He was brought up on charges a couple of times, false charges, because of his mysticism and as a clergy member. And he finally just went into reclusion, and he lived the bulk of his life practicing medicine and quietly helping people and in reclusion and meditation. And that's contemplation. And that's another way of approaching this. And Portage actually is, his life in some ways is suggestive of what I'm alluding to toward the end of the book, as far as, I mean, the book itself, a mystical state, is a play on words, because, of course, mystical state is a state of consciousness, but the book is also about the idea of a mystical origin or center to political life, that community life can be a reflection of, or to some extent even a manifestation of, Gnostic or spiritual center. And that second meeting is reflected in Portage's life. Portage had a small community around him of like-minded people who shared this kind of perspective, and you see that in all of their writings, everything that we possess. Thomas Bromley, his journal and book Journey to the book Way to the Sabbath of Rest, all of these inner chronicles of the people in that circle reflect this shared Gnostic understanding. So I think in some ways somebody like Portage and his English group, which is very close to, in many respects, the early Christian Gnostics, I think represents a kind of prototype, a kind of model for what is possible now and in the future.
But Arthur, what exactly would a Gnostic polity look like? I'm sort of getting, and maybe this is just as a reference point, as a sort of libertarian with very strong social gospel undertones. Am I close?
Yeah, I think libertarian is probably not that far off, really. But what I'm suggesting at the end of the book is I point to some examples of decentralization. I think centralized power, centralized kind of imperial power structures are not conducive to the kind of thing that I'm referring to here under the term mystical state. I think decentralization and a more decentralized social and political structure is very healthy, and you see that actually in Switzerland. Switzerland is to some extent a model for this. It's a federal model. There is a national government, but the power resides in the cantons and in the local provinces and in local government more than it does in the central government. And I think that's conducive then to communities that take on their own flavor and flower in their own individual ways, as opposed to a kind of centralized, technocratic, more imperial state structure, which though it can be entertaining, sometimes it's sort of functioning as entertainment, it isn't always that. It can be very, very intrusive and very overbearing. And I think if a Gnostic polity or community emerges, and some of them have already emerged historically. I mean, it's not simply something imagined in the future. There have been such communities, and there have been communal and community experiments and political experiments. What I'm suggesting is a way of understanding those that's very different than the normal kind of political, secular understanding. I'm injecting a religious and a spiritual dimension that is Gnostic, that just has not been part of the conversation.
And Arthur, can you give maybe just a few examples of these Gnostic communities for the listener so they can have, again, a reference?
Well, I think there's different ways of understanding this. And many of the communal experiments, at least a number of them, if you go back and look, even if you look strictly at American history, you can look at the Transcendentalists in the 19th century, and offshoots include Brook Farm on the one hand, Fruitlands, Bronson Alcott's communal experiment. I'm not offering these as models, I'm saying that they emerged from something other than a strictly kind of secular perspective. Alcott was really very much focused on Burma and on Burma's spirituality, and that was what informed his worldview. If you go back earlier, actually, I think the Italian Renaissance is an example, and that emerged out of the Hermetic and Platonic works, and Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. So that there too, the Renaissance itself has this, to some extent, as its cultural origin, and by this I mean the Platonic tradition that I'm referring to all the way through this book. And I think contemporary examples would include the various, and these are very much under the radar, but there are a lot of Buddhists and some Sufi and mystically inclined communities that they're not necessarily political in the sense that they have attempted to secede and form some political state, but they are communities with a spiritual focus. And I think there are a fair number of examples of these historically. The 1960s is another example that I look at in the book. The late 60s are usually seen in a strictly secular perspective, very, very truncated. But actually, I argue that there's a spiritual center to the 60s. There was a reason that all of those communes emerged, and it's not strictly what I refer to as historicist in its orientation. This period of the late 60s, early 70s had as part of the impetus the emergence of an awareness of non-dual consciousness as a possibility. So I think that was a very hopeful period, actually, in many respects, and I don't think it's been understood quite right yet. So that's what I'm trying to do with these counter-histories, is offer a different way of understanding things that are familiar to people. But once you read through and reread and begin to see things in this different way, a lot of things that one might have seen and that were construed one way are very different if you see them in this alternative way.
Yeah, and it seems it's harder than ever because we live in a increasingly secular society, and as you write and you point out certain thinkers like McLuhan and I know I'm going to say it wrong, Jean Baudrillard, but that we're bombarded with so much technology, it's almost like we have no choice if we really want a spiritual life to go into our own little communes for a while, and that way that's where we can find an inward journey, right?
Well, it's possible. I think we face special challenges. You know, the kind of technology that surrounds us, the technological penumbra that we carry with us, and that is intensifying with things like Twitter and Facebook and all of these forms of communication that and cell phones, netbooks, and the technological penumbra pulls us outward, and it pulls our consciousness out toward these social media and other things that actually flatten out the nature of our awareness. There's a couple of few books that have come out about this recently, and really interesting studies that have started to emerge about the effects of technology on consciousness. And what I'm arguing in the book is that all of that is well and good. I mean, I use technology myself. I'm not arguing against it. What I'm saying is we need to be more conscious of it. And it isn't necessarily a matter of moving to, someplace particular group, but rather a matter of inward awareness, as opposed to which effectively is a counter movement to the seemingly inexorable pull outward of the society that surrounds us.
You also write that Gnosis can be the bridge that harmonizes nature and humanity's constant desire for draining natural sources. Obviously, this is again part of the Abrahamic attitude that this land is our land, and we have dominion over all things of the earth, and therefore there is that separation between us and earth, and that separation between us and God, and here we are again. How can Gnosis help this, especially because since the Gnostics were always, caricatured as world-hating dualists who rejected the world?
Yeah, I don't really accept that depiction of the Gnostics. I think that things are a little more complicated than that. To some extent, I think there's an extent to which those who were the victors, or largely the victors, projected dualism onto the Gnostics and projected that idea of duality. Whereas when you look at Gnosticism, when you look at the kinds of figures that I'm discussing in the book, they're folks who are aiming toward not dualism, but transcendence and non-dual awareness. And I think non-dual awareness, in its very nature, the cure, or it is the counter to and a way of healing this dualism that does pervade our society. We aren't necessarily even always aware of it, but the technology, the vehicles we're in, our whole way of studying and thinking about things is dualistic. It is based on the idea of objectification of everything. And non-dualism is transcendence of movement toward a kind of consciousness in which self and other is not so strictly emphasizing self and emphasizing the distinction between self and other, self and God, self and nature. It's possible to go beyond that, and that's what these folks, all in different ways, I think, are telling us. And that's what I'm trying to convey in the book, at least in part.
Yeah, Arthur, and you certainly do a very good job, and it's always ironic because, again, in your book you talk about there's always a duality no matter what you do. There's an equal and opposing force no matter what stance you take in this era, and it seems we can never even move or come to a middle ground. But then you take, for example, again, the example is environmentalists, those who believe that the divinity is in nature, while there is, of course, those who believe that divinity is beyond nature. But then you look at the quote-unquote most dualistic Gnostics in history, the Manichaeans. They believe that divinity was both transcendent and immanent, and they were known as some of the most nature-loving people in the world.
Yeah, it's really great that you bring the Manichaeans up. I didn't cover them too much or deal with them too much in this particular book, because this book is exploring these themes in a particular way, and there's a kind of movement through the different chapters to the final vision that you see. Manichaeism is something that I looked at in a book that I will publish. I've already written it. I just typically I wait a little bit and then bring them out. But this is one in which I write quite in some detail about Manichaeism. And the Manichaees, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's one of the great historical mysteries. I think there are very different ways of seeing the Manichaees and their religion of light. I think we're given often a kind of caricature of those folks, just as we are with the Gnostics. The victors have written the history, but when you start looking closely at it, you begin to see other things, and then you begin to wonder about how this was told in the first place and what's really there. So you're quite right. I think the Manichaeism fits into this in a really interesting way, but that's for a future discussion, I think.
Certainly, yeah, and of course, they talk about the Gnostics being world haters, but in truth, and of course, we have evidence from Plotinus and the Gnostics were always, as much as they could in society, While it was the early Christians, like the Desert Fathers or whatever, who completely rejected society and nature at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are things still to be looked into here, and I think we can look at history. At the minimum, we can say that there are alternative ways of understanding it, and different ways, different perspectives that through which we can see the same thing. And I've come back to that theme because I think it's central to understanding what I'm doing in this book. And I found it exciting, actually. I hope that that you enjoy it and that other people enjoy it. I found it exciting because the excitement for me with the book was realizing that it's possible to bring together these disparate parts into a coherent, larger picture that has not been told before in this way, has not been offered before, and in quite this way. And for me, it was exciting for it to come together. It was a long process to get to this point, even though it's a short book.
I thought it was a great book because it really jars and changes and challenges you to change your way of thinking, which, again, going back to that cul-de-sac situation, we seem to, society is trapped, or as you say, we are in this state of crisis, and no movement, no idea, no religion seems to be able to evolve anymore or just move forward. We are so trapped, and your book gives some very good alternatives. What advice would you give to somebody who maybe hasn't read your book, or do you have a positive view of where we might be going?
Well, that's what the last part of the book is about, because I think we are in a period of continuing crisis. I think that's especially true for the United States. The value of the dollar is continuing day by day. It's been continuing to drop. There are periodic upswings briefly, and then it resumes its decline. That has really fairly significant long-term consequences. There are environmental and other things that face us, other issues. And I think it's vital to also to step back from that. I mean, the fact that the parliamentary system that we have, the representative system, seems paralyzed by many of the problems that face us and unable to really deal with them. It's easy to see the crisis and not step back and see beyond that. And what I'm trying to do in the book is point toward, on the other side of crisis, actually is great possibility, but the only way that can be realized is if there is, on some people's part at least, an awareness of how culture can emerge out of a non-dual consciousness or non-dual awareness, how that's possible and what the relationship is there. And the emergence of culture is the emergence of an alternative way of being in the world, and I think that can be very positive. I think we can have a kind of renaissance. Actually, what I'm pointing to at the end of the book is a kind of new renaissance, and that's on the other side of these crises. And it may be that we have to have wrenching crises before we can get to that, but I think it is possible.
And of course, a lot of this, again, is just simply going back to history and seeing how history might have been, or the alternative views that history and its thinkers have given us, and have been buried, right?
That's right, because that's where you find the possibilities and the possibilities for alternatives. And you're quite right. Figure like, if you look at many of the contemporary postmodern thinkers, I give the example in the book of John Baudrillard, whom you mentioned, and Baudrillard had this idea that we're trapped in a kind of hall of mirrors in media driven technocratic society, that we're kind of frozen in a self-reflective state and kind of stasis. And what I'm offering in this book is an entirely different way of understanding the world, for which the kind of world that Baudrillard refers to. It does exist in the context that he's referring to, but it is not the only world, and is not the only way to see the world. It's just what exists if you want to concentrate on the McLuhan-esque, kind of Baudrillard-esque hall of mirrors of media-driven society, but that's not all there is. There are alternatives.
Well, I certainly advise the reader to get your book, because I thought it was very good and also very important. But I think that's all the time we have today, Arthur. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing the mystical state.
Hey, I really appreciate it, Miguel. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, and I hope people do enjoy it, and I look forward to coming back again at some point to talk with you in the future.
Well, we certainly want you to come back, especially with that next book, and we can discuss, get our feet wet more with the Manichaeans and their viewpoint, which should definitely be a great complement to this book.
Yeah, that's right. So I look forward to it. In the meantime, thanks very much.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Arthur vs. Luz on an important interview in this era when all ideas, philosophies, theologies, and even practicalities have hit a cul-de-sac. It's like the ending to Animal Farm, or the same plot as Terry Gilliam's Brazil. Again, Arthur is the author of The Secret History of Western Sexual Mysticism, Magic and Mysticism, An Introduction to Western Esoteric Traditions, and The New Inquisitions, as well as chair of the Department of Religious Studies and professor in the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University. For more information on Arthur, please visit his website, arthurversluz.com, and that is VERSLUIS.com. And again, I would certainly download Aeon Byte number 37, The New Inquisition, with Arthur as a sober companion to this episode. Now, I'd like to quickly discuss the Gnostic sage Basilides, the one who channeled C.G. Jung in his 7 sermons to the dead, and Arthur feels as one of those roads less traveled mankind should have taken almost 2,000 years ago that would have made all the difference to this day. Basilides was a hierophant in the early 2nd century from Alexandria. Some believe he was perhaps the teacher of Valentinus himself. We have no writings of him except what the Church Fathers recorded or quoted. It is said Basilides was a disciple of Glaucus, himself a disciple of the rockhead Simon Peter. Simply to enter his prestigious school, an aspirant had to take a 5-year vow of silence. Basilides claimed only 1 in 1,000 ever made it in, but he felt that silence was the first step into the journey of Gnosis, that knowledge of the heart. Basilides taught the doctrines of reincarnation and karma, believed that Jesus came in the flesh, but was plucked from the cross and replaced by Simon of Cyrene. And many scholars assume this view survived and was later borrowed by Islam. Scholars have also noted his teachings are eerily similar to many schools of Buddhism and Hinduism, although he would never claim to be anything other than a Christian. Basilides wrote that nothingness, or non-being, was a primordial state, but a seed of all potential existed within it that exploded in a big bang that created all reality, all universes. His version of the aeons were the 3 sonships that helped bring order to the cosmos, although the last one, the Holy Spigot, did not have the power to return to the God beyond being and spread herself out to permeate every aspect of the multiverse. The material universe also developed reason, its own version of the Logos, just as the first sonship became the reason of the God beyond being. In the words of Basilides, quote, coming into existence, he raised himself aloft and soared upward and was borne above in all his entirety as far as the great firmament. There he remained because he thought there was none above him, and thinking himself lord and ruler and a wise master builder, he betook himself to the creation of the creatures of the universe. And this is, of course, another version of Jehovah, as usual. But like Plato and the Gnostic Hermetics, he was a neutral to benign entity, along with his angels. Some church fathers said Basilides claimed the demiurge was an alien god named Abraxas, or that Abraxas was the god beyond being. Basilides certainly saw the universe differently than the other Gnostic schools of thought, since the god beyond being had willed everything to happen as it needed to happen in order to keep order. There were no personified actors or good and evil characters, just divinity constantly emanating upward and downward. The only correction needed was the light sparks of the holy spigot returning to the God beyond being. And thus the second sonship became Jesus Christ, who brought Gnosis to the universe, even to the demiurge, on how to get the third sonship, the holy spigot, back to the divine realm. And part of the holy spigot lies within each human. Other than that, Basilides' view is similar to the, quote, that art that philosophy of the Upanishads. The brighter light must return to stand with non-being. Reincarnation and karma exist to purify the shards of the holy spigot through either Gnosis or the gospel. Another important aspect of Basilides' sort of non-dualistic universal Gnosticism, and Arthur stresses this in his book, is his view of negative or apophatic theology, in which the divine is understood in a series of meditation or mental exercises, not by what it is, but by what it isn't. Layers are peeled back, and eventually the true God is nothing, neither existence nor non-existence, the ayin of the Kabbalists, and therefore for mortals the ultimate state is non-being. Apophatic theology is present in all the heterodox branches of most religions. It's a path of transcending all that is temporal and finite, even if it is part of the divine's outer husk. The true God is really ok on theos in Greek, or not being God. And humanity needs to start pretending it's not God and return to its egoic dissolved essence of migrating upward into non-being. And if not, and if the Gnostic and Neoplatonic wisdom are ignored yet again, perhaps Arthur and me are wasting our breath. Perhaps any action is futile, and the loaded dice of Jehovah was cast at the moment of creation, and history is set in bloody stone. The end will be indeed like the end of Animal Farm, instead of a Dionysian animal house. Perhaps Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio is also a waste of time, but we can be ethereal Don Quixotes, can't we? Or maybe Philip K. Dick's warning in The Man in the High Castle sums it all up and is the best advice possible. They want to be the agents, not the victims of history. They identify with God's power and believe they are godlike. This is their basic madness. They are overcome by some archetype. Their egos have expanded psychotically so that they cannot tell where they begin and the Godhead leaves off. It is not hubris, not pride. It is inflation of the ego to its ultimate confusion between him who worships and that which is worshipped. Man has not eaten God. God has eaten man. What they do not comprehend is man's helplessness. I am weak, small, of no consequence to the universe. It does not notice me. I live on unseen. But why is that bad? Isn't it better that way? Whom the gods notice they destroy. Be small, and you will escape the jealousy of the great. The empire never ended.